welcome back. Um, Welcome to what is essentially a very, very belated Social History Sunday on the subject of Christmas. Um, Now, I haven't put a video up for 2 weeks, and I apologise for that, but I have been as bad as a dog. I've had the flu, and I've really, really been flawed by it. Because foolishly, last year I neglected to get my flu jab, and then I've gone and caught the flu, and it has wiped me out. I managed to get up for a couple of hours on Christmas Day, but other than that, I've been in bed for 2 weeks. Thankfully, I'm on the mend, touch wood. Last couple of days, not been so bad. So what I thought I'd do is, originally I was going to do a couple of videos on the subject of a medieval Christmas. The first of which I was going to post on Christmas Eve. But what I'm going to try and do with this video is the 2 or 3 videos I was going to do, I'm going to try and compress them down. So we're going to talk about what was a medieval Christmas, what foods were eaten, and what traditions came out of the medieval Christmas that we still follow today in England. And hopefully, touch wood, we'll get these 3 videos all compressed down into one. So bear with me. I hope you don't find this too boring. And hopefully I'll get through it in one go. So first off, what was Christmas? Well, the medieval Christmas was a very important, if not the most important, religious and social celebration of the year. It was very, very important to everybody. Now, you may know that within the Christian religion there are certain food restrictions, as in you're not allowed to eat meat on a Friday, but you can eat fish. Clergy are supposed to fast on a Wednesday and a Friday to celebrate to commemorate the betrayal and the crucifixion of Christ. Things like that. There were lots of them in the medieval era. However, Christmas was considered so important that all of those restrictions were rescinded, and they were suspended, which meant that anybody and everybody could eat whatever they could get their hands on. And it was perfectly acceptable by society and the church to do so. So, what was Christmas? It was essentially 12 days of celebrating, of partying, of religious devotion. It was basically a hedonistic free-for-all. First day of which, and it was a 12-day period as well. The first thing about Christmas you've got to realise is that nobody did any work. The only people who actually did any work at all were the serving staff in the bigger houses, in the manors and the castles and the palaces. But even they were on half day. They only came together to work in order to produce the feasts that the family and the nobility and their guests would take part in during the evening. During the day, they had time off. It was their own day. They could attend religious services. They could visit with family. They had their own Christmas. They only worked half day. The rest of the population had the whole 12 days off, because that's what Christmas was. 12 days. Started on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve. Now, Christmas Eve has several significant meanings. First off, it's the day that Mary and Joseph arrived and were directed to the stable where they were to stay. It also commemorates the day, it's Mary, Mother of Jesus' day as well, so she was venerated on that day. Christmas Day, obviously, is the birth of Christ. Now, there are lots of other significant religious dates that follow on from Christmas Day. For instance, the 26th, St. Stephen's Day. Now, St. Stephen was the first martyr within the Christian religion. He was also one of the 7 deacons appointed by the apostles, and part of his responsibility was to ensure that the poorest people within the communities had plenty to eat, that nobody starved. And as a result, he's become, we call it Boxing Day now, but Boxing Day as a title has only really been around since Charles Dickens. He was the first person to call it Boxing Day. Prior to that, it was St. Stephen's Day. And that was the day on which everybody made sure that the poorest in the community had enough food to eat. Especially the clergy. That was the day they went around and made sure that those who weren't capable of providing for themselves had food available. So that's St. Stephen's Day, the 26th. The 27th was St. John the Evangelist Day. Now, John the Evangelist was charged with spreading the word of God. He was one of the first apostles as well, so that's his day. That's the 27th. The 28th is actually the Day of the Innocents. That's the day when Herod sent his soldiers around the Holy Land and killed the innocent children. All those children who were under the age of 1 year were murdered by Herod and his troops. And that's celebrated on the 28th of December. And there's a couple of other days that go on as well. For instance, 12th night, the 12th day of Christmas, is also known as the Epiphany. Now the Epiphany is also the day when, according to the Nativity story, was the day when the Magi, the three wise men, the three kings, found their way to the stable where Christ was. And the Epiphany part of it is that they venerated and recognized Jesus Christ, this young baby, this young child, as being a king among men on earth, and presented him with gifts worthy of a king: gold, frankincense and myrrh. Now with the medieval Christmas, 12th night is also the day when traditionally small gifts were given out to friends and family and people within the community, because that's to celebrate the giving of the gifts to Jesus Christ, to the baby Jesus. Not Christmas Day, that comes in much, much later. But traditionally, 12th night, that's when you gave out gifts and things like that. Now, they weren't always, but anyway, getting off the point. So that's what Christmas was. From Christmas Eve to 12th night, 12 days of Christmas, on the 5th of January. Right, so what sort of things did they eat? Right, well, here we go. It depended, obviously, on the social class you would belong to. Now, if you were nobility, royalty, that sort of thing, if you were invited to the big posh banquets, of which there was one every day throughout the 12 days of Christmas, you would see some fantastic dishes. Swan stuffed with goose, stuffed with duck, stuffed with other small, like moorhens and coots and widgeons and things like that. Fantastic things. Stuffed peacock, all sorts, whole haunches of venison. In the fireplace of the banquet hall there might be a whole ox being roasted. So there was lots of fantastic, extravagant foods available to the royalty. However, one thing which was always centre stage on the table, and there might be a dozen or so of these on the banqueting table itself within the banquet hall, was a wild boar's head. Now, a wild boar were big animals. Heads would be like, they were monsters. And the significance was it was supposed to represent the triumph of good over evil. Now, I don't know why that's become part of the medieval Christmas, I don't know, but that's what it's supposed to represent. And it would be placed on the table, and it would be a delicacy. It would be the main meat course of the Christmas banquets. As well as the boar's head and the stuffed swans and peacocks, things like that, and the whole haunches of venison and the spit roast ox and things like that, you would also have lots of pies. Fruit pies were becoming really popular. For instance, apple pie, the first known recorded recipe for an apple pie, was written down by Geoffrey Chaucer, I believe, within the Canterbury Tales, which is a 14th century novel, one of the first novels ever written for popular consumption. So apple pies, pear pies, game pies, which would contain boar and venison and rabbit and hare, all sorts of different things baked into a pie. And some quite esoteric, some quite weird things. I mean, has everybody heard of the nursery rhyme, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie? When the pie was open, the birds began to sing. Isn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? And this is the sort of thing that was produced. Birds baked into pies. Blackbirds were especially, songbirds especially, were quite, bearing in mind in the 1300s, it's still essentially French, and the French would eat some weird stuff. But anyway, that's besides the point. So lots and lots of extravagant meals, extravagant dishes available. But oddly, one of the most popular dishes served in a medieval Christmas, believe it or not, was onion soup as a first course. The medieval English, we English in the medieval era, loved onion soup. And lots of other types of soups as well, but onion was really popular. It was seen as being something quite extravagant and quite popular with all classes. Not always onions, sometimes it would be made with leek and things like that. But soups became really, really popular because they were seen as being extravagant. To make a soup was the amount of time it took to make a nice soup was quite an extravagance. Now, so that's the richest end of the Christmas. Now, bear in mind, these feasts would happen every day. Now, if we come down into the middle classes, the middle echelons of society, the tradesmen, the artisans, the merchants, the ones who weren't nobility but had money, they also were quite pretentious as well, just like middle class people are today. They liked to be seen to be able to afford the richer things in life. So while the nobility and the royalty had a proper boar's head, the middle classes would actually have, it would possibly a boar's head, possibly a sow's head, but it would just be a plain old ordinary pig's head. It wouldn't be a wild boar's head. However, they would be cooked in such a way, marinated with wines and with fruits to darken the skin to make them look like a wild boar's head. They would also they might have access to beef. They wouldn't have venison or other game, but they had beef and they had lamb and they had lots of pork. Pork was eaten a lot in medieval England. For instance, it's been estimated that England within a year, not counting a famine year, within a year could produce enough pork that every man, woman and child could eat between 40 and 50 pounds of pork every year. That's a lot. That's a lot of meat. If you think about it in terms of production for a population, 40 or 50 pounds of pork, and that's not in counting other meats either. But at Christmas especially, a lot of it was eaten. Again, other meats were available. For instance, hare was quite popular. Salmon was extremely popular. Fish, a lot of fish was eaten by the middle classes. But they also had the goose. Just like the upper classes, they would have goose rather than a swan, which might be stuffed with a duck, and you might have a 3-bird roast rather than a 4-bird roast. Which even today, a lot of people within England, it's becoming more and more popular again, is a 3 or 4-bird roast. One bird stuffed within another, and you eaten Christmas lunch. So goose was almost ubiquitous, and there's a few reasons for that. We've discussed before, but we'll come back to that. But they also had rabbit. They had jugged or preserved meats that weren't necessarily available at that time of the year, but were preserved through till Christmas, and lots of things going on. Now, if you come down to the lower echelons, the serfs and the peasant farmers, people like that, now they were actually quite canny. They didn't tend to have a pig's head because they saw the value of the pig's head it was more valuable to them to sell them to the middle classes and not bother eating the pig's head at all. They still had plenty of pork to eat. Gammon joints, shoulder, road shoulder, things like that. There's plenty to eat. They also had rabbit and hare and any number of birds that were available they could take. There were no restrictions, either social or religious, on the type or number of birds that you could take. So goose especially was ubiquitous. A couple of reasons. Now we've talked about this before. You could pay your taxes with goose feathers. For instance, at this time of the year, Christmas, from October onwards until back end of January, February, we have an influx of grey lag geese onto the eastern coast of England. A lot of birds come here, as well as the domestic birds as well. And as well as the many, many, many flocks of geese which were brought here by the Romans and have bred and interbred with the barnacle geese and especially the grey-lag geese. So there was lots of them available. And on average, a grey-lag goose will produce 46 long feathers. Now 46 long feathers is a lot of feathers. Each feather, if used carefully, could fletch a single arrow. So that could actually provide, 2 or 3 birds could provide your entire tax bill for the year. Now if you were able to get a bird a day throughout the whole of the Christmas period, you paid your tax bill. You're doing well. So anyway, so there was the geese. Rabbits were wild by this time, even though they were brought here by the Normans in the 1060s, 1070s. By this time, the 1300s, they'd actually become wild. So you could take as many rabbits as you could capture. Hares, same thing. Lots and lots of stuff like that. Any birds, again, blackbirds. Not so much crows because they would tended to be a bit sour and that, but they were actually quite often raised. There were rookeries where rooks and ravens were raised specifically to eat during the Christmas period and to take the feathers. Raven feathers could be used to make arrows for private sale that weren't sold to the military, to the crown. So there's lots of money making going on as well as the celebrations. Now we come to some traditions which have carried through to present day England. The first of those, now we mentioned the boar's head. Now the lower echelons of society didn't really bother with the boar's head as something to eat. They sold it to the middle classes and made a bit of money. However, what they did do is they would make a cake in the shape of a boar's head, and this became the first traditional Christmas cake. And this comes in around the 12th, 13th, 14th century, and basically they would make a replica boar's head out of a fruit cake decorated and covered in marzipan. Marzipan, by the way, ground almonds introduced by the Romans. And they made it using dried fruit from wine making. Now there's a lot of wine drank in England because a lot of people don't realise that up until the 15th, 16th century, England was warm enough and they had the climate to produce and grow their own wine vineyards. And they produced lots and lots and lots of grapes, black, red and white grapes to make different types of wine. Now part of the winemaking process was the grapes would be crushed to extract the juice. Now the fruit carcasses that were left were dried and they became raisins, sultanas and currants, and they were used in baking for several different things. And one of the main things for Christmas was the production of the traditional Christmas cake, which was made with chopped up fruit mixed with sugars from sugar beet and things like that, various herbs and spices which may or may not have been available depending on the time period obviously, then mixed with flour and baked to create a cake which was then carved into a boar's head. Now traditionally today, if you go into an English, especially an English working class home, you will probably find a Christmas cake. And the Christmas cake will last the entire Christmas period. And as you go in, after your evening meal or whatever, yeah, you might have a slice of cake with a brandy or a cup of coffee or something like that, just to end the day, to end that particular day of the Christmas festivities, slice of Christmas cake. And it was the same in the medieval era. Now, another thing that has become tradition within England is the ubiquitous mince pie. Now, a lot of people outside England go, what is it? Why? Basically, it's not what people think, and it didn't start off as many people think as well. A lot of people seem to think that originally it was made out of minced meat. It's not. Now, the word meat actually means any fleshy substance that comes off anything. That can include animals, but it can also include fruits and vegetables. The fleshy part of, for instance, an apple, the fleshy part of a plum, the fleshy part of a grape, it was known as meat. So there's a difference. You had minced meat, which comes from the Anglo-Saxon to mince or to grind, and you had mince meat, which comes from the Latin meaning minuscule, which is small. It's not ground, it's chopped up. The substances going into the flesh of the fruits going into the mince pie were chopped up small. For instance, 1/4 of an inch size sort of thing. But not only that, they also went into mince or minuscule pies. Most mince pies, the vast majority of them, which are sold even today, are only 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter and only make you half an inch deep. They are minuscule, they are small pies, and that's what the mince pie is. Again, made with the dried fruit that comes from winemaking. However, it wasn't just mixed, it wasn't made in the same way as a fruit cake would be, where it was mixed with flour. In the case of the mince pie, it was mixed with suet, which is fat taken from around the kidneys of kidneys and liver of a cow and sheep. And it was mixed with the suet fat, and it was also mixed with chopped up apple and pear and things like that. They might have alcohol added to it, and then it was mixed up and it was boiled together, and then it was put into a pastry case and baked. And there you have the ubiquitous traditional mince pie, which is coming in at around this time, the 12th, 13th, 14th century. And they became so extravagant that Oliver Cromwell tried to ban them, to have them banned as being salacious and decadent and not fitting with a good Christian faith. But anyway, besides the point, that's a different video. So there we have the tradition of the mince pie. Now the main one that comes from Christmas, the main English tradition, which just about everybody throughout the world has heard about, is the full English breakfast. Now the full English breakfast, as we know it today, starts to come together with the Norman conquest. However, the various elements of the full English breakfast date back to the Roman period. The Romans introduced a pudding to the British psyche. Now a pudding, contrary to what some of you American guys may think, a pudding originally, is a small boiled sausage made from the intestine of whatever animal, pork or lamb or beef or whatever, and stuffed with minced or ground meat or other meat products such as black pudding. We call it black pudding, the rest of the world calls it blood sausage. And that was basically made with ground grains mixed with blood, either pig's blood or pork blood, pig blood or cow blood, and then put into an intestine case and boiled until it solidified, and then it was hung up in the rafters of the home above the kitchen fire to dry out. White sausage, similar sort of thing, but it was made with beans and with legumes, with other vegetables put into it, mixed with animal fats such as suet. And again, it was boiled, all ground up and boiled made into a paste, stuffed into the intestines to make link sausages, as we would call them today, boiled to cook it and then hung up to dry in the rafters. But there was lots of other stuff put into them. Ground beef for the upper classes and middle classes, ground pork for everybody, beef and kidney, chicken, goose patty, lots and lots of different varieties. I've even found recipes for fish sausages. Sounds revolting, but that was the time. And these would be boiled and dried, and in some cases, some of these really heavily herbed and spiced sausages could last up to 2 years. For instance, a pork pudding produced in Spain, chorizo, can last up to 2 years. So they were made, and everything was made in preparation for the Christmas feasts. Now, so we're talking about full English breakfast. So you had your puddings or your sausages. So part of your breakfast you might have, on an ordinary day, you'd have cold meat or cold fish, or possibly pottage or something like that, which we talked about in other videos. During the Christmas period, you would have your puddings. You'd have your black pudding and your white pudding, and you might have a pork pudding or a chicken pudding, black pudding, and sausages, bacon, basically. You would then have your bacon. So you'd have puddings, bacon, which was basically a rasher of bacon that might have been salted or smoked, which was cooked over, hung over the spit on the fire until it crisped up, and then it was eaten as part of your breakfast. So black pudding, sausage, bacon, and beans. Now I've mentioned the beans before. I found quite a few recipes for beans. Now you Americans, for instance, and Australians I believe as well, when you eat beans you mainly eat pinto beans, navy beans and things like that. In England, even to this day, and since the Norman conquest when they were introduced, we eat haricot beans. And that's it. We don't really eat any other beans. The mainstay, which has always been a mainstay of our diet, a staple since the Norman conquest, right up until today, is beans in various types of sauce. Now some of the most popular medieval sauces